I was in a windowless room in a hotel 2 blocks off Bahnhofstrasse, the kind of room that tries to smell like nothing and fails. It was 2:43 in the morning in Zurich, and the only light came from the minibar, a pale square glow that made the carpet look like wet moss. Someone knocked. 3 times, slow, like a metronome. I pressed my thumb against the door's peephole, felt the cold circle of glass, and watched a man in a gray coat shift his weight from one shoe to the other. I did not know his name yet. I knew the envelope in his hand had traveled farther than I had, and I had flown across the ocean for it. When I opened the door, he stepped inside and nodded once, as if we were continuing a conversation we had started years ago. He placed the envelope on the desk between the neatly stacked hotel stationery and a pen I had not touched, and he said, softly, "It is done." There was no applause. There never is at 2:43. I grew up in a one-story house on a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place where the winter wind whistles through the seams of the windows and you can smell your neighbor's laundry detergent on Tuesdays. My dad, Mark, was a mechanic. His hands carried the sweet, metallic scent of engine coolant no matter how often he scrubbed. My mom, Elaine, worked nights at the county hospital, moving from room to room like a steady lighthouse. We were not tragic. We were tight. The week before Christmas, the heater coughed like an old smoker and gave up, and Dad stood in the basement with a flashlight clenched in his teeth and laughed at the stubbornness of the universe. "Give me 17 minutes, he said, though no one had asked. It took him 40. We spent those 40 minutes under quilts that smelled like cedar, our breaths making small clouds, and when the heat came back, the whole house exhaled. At school I was skinny and fast-talking, a kid with shoes from a discount bin and a backpack that squeaked on one strap. My best friend was Jordan Hayes, who wore his baseball cap backwards and had a grin that made teachers forgive him for things they had not seen yet. We met in 7th grade detention after I used the science room's soldering iron without asking. "You always moving like you're late for something," Jordan said, drumming a pencil on the desk. "Maybe I am," I answered. It sounded cooler in my head than out loud. We stuck anyway. The first computer I took apart was a beige box on our kitchen table when I was 14. Dad bought it at a garage sale for $20. "Do not break it," he said, which, given the situation, was the only outcome available. It was past midnight when I finished. The clock above the stove said 1:19. The machine hummed, stubborn, and then the screen blinked awake. I remember the smell of warm dust. That's the smell of possibility. People love to say that, later, as if we all recognized the smell in the moment. In the moment, I just sneezed. By sophomore year, I was trading parts on online forums, wrapping sticks of memory in anti-static bags like candy, shipping them out with my name written too carefully on the labels. In the afternoons, I worked at Mr. Patel's convenience store, and he let me keep broken lottery scratchers because I liked the silver powder on my fingers. He said, "Evan, you are a funny boy," which I think was his way of saying I made him nervous. After closing, I would walk home past the river, listening to the slow slap of water against the concrete pilings of the bridge. The air smelled like cold iron. Sometimes a train would pass, and I would count the cars. 41, 42, 43. I liked when the numbers rose. It felt like a promise I had no right to demand. There were girls, of course. In my junior year, there was Emily Carter, who smelled like vanilla shampoo and moved through the world as if it were quieter for her. She watched me fix the lab printer one afternoon and said, "You make broken things look patient." I did not know what to do with that, so I nodded, which made her laugh. We went to a movie. Our knees touched. She squeezed my hand during a loud scene. We kissed exactly twice near her mom's minivan. She left for a college in North Carolina and wrote me 2 emails that summer, each one exactly 5 lines long. And then life rolled forward, and she became a warm place in the past, like a pool we once swam in at dusk. I did not get into the colleges with their brick gates and their glossy brochures. I went to the state school 40 minutes away and commuted. My car was a sun-faded Civic with a dent that looked like a fist. I took classes in the day and stocked shelves at night. I learned databases from a professor who wore the same tie 4 days in a row. I learned more from a message board where people argued with great politeness and occasional rage. Around 2 in the morning, I would buy coffee from a machine that sounded like it was swallowing and sit alone in a lab that smelled faintly of dry erase ink, writing code that made me feel like I was building stairs in the dark. The first thing I ever sold that mattered was a script that matched addresses from different spreadsheets and resolved the differences with a weighted guess. It sounds boring. It is boring until you are a company trying to ship 10,000 packages and every street versus ST costs you time and money. A logistics manager named Marcus Lee paid me $300 for it. He said, "You just saved me a week." I said, "You just paid my rent." We both laughed for different reasons. He introduced me to a friend at a warehouse 2 towns over. The friend gave me a small office with a door that did not lock and a view of forklifts. It was not glamorous, but I could write without anyone telling me to stop. Here is a thing I learned early. Almost nothing moves without a middle layer quietly translating one thing into another. People think about the boxes on trucks and the trucks on interstates. They do not think about the software that tells the boxes where to sit, so a forklift can find them in 9 minutes instead of 12. It is like fiber optic cable, thin strands of glass carrying light under streets and oceans, a city's worth of conversation moving through something thinner than a hair. The world is held together by things you do not see unless you go looking. In 2008, the air itself felt nervous. Jobs vanished the way leaves vanish in a cold wind. Storefronts went dark. Our landlord started calling every Monday at 9. I took any contract that would pay me by Friday. My palm twitched from holding a mouse too long. At 3:11 one morning, I stood in a warehouse while snow fell outside in slow, fat flakes and tried not to panic. Marcus said, "We are going to make it." I said, "We are." It was not a lie exactly. It was hope wearing a hat and pretending to be certainty. I met Sophie Alvarez when I was 26. She had a laugh like a run-on sentence and a way of tilting her head when she listened that made you confess things you had not planned to say out loud. She wrote code that made mine look careful and old. The first week she worked with me, she pushed a fix at 1:14 in the morning and sent me a message with a single line, "Try it now." I did. It was as if a window had been cleaned. She shrugged when I told her that. "I like when things line up," she said, closing her laptop with a click that sounded final. We sat on the warehouse roof after that, sometimes eating takeout dumplings, our breath visible, the city humming below us like an appliance left on. 2 years later, the 4 of us, me, Sophie, Marcus, and a new hire named Hannah Green who had the steadiest eyes I had ever seen, sat around a conference table that wobbled and signed the papers that created a company. The table wobbled because one leg had been replaced with a stack of old manuals. We kept it that way for luck. We called the company North Star because it sounded like the kind of thing you looked for when you were lost. People told us to pick a name with cloud in it. We did not. We were building a platform to stitch together the language of warehouses and trucks and stores and e-commerce carts, so a box would never be lost just because 2 systems disagreed about what blue meant. The first investor who said yes was a man named Riley Bennett. He wore the same blue blazer every time we met. The second time we met, at 9:12 in the morning at a coffee shop with a floor that slanted toward the door, he asked me what kept me up at night. I said, "My furnace." He waited. I said, "And the idea that we could be right about the problem and wrong about the market." He nodded like I had passed a test. He wired $2 million 2 days later. I looked at the number on the screen, then looked again, then closed my eyes and counted to 20, as if the money might leave if I stared too long. Sophie ordered more servers. Hannah made a hiring plan that fit on a single sheet of paper. Marcus took his family to dinner and paid in cash because he liked the feeling. We moved into an office with windows that faced east. In winter, the light came in low and gold, and we pretended we had planned it. We bought plants and forgot to water them. We ordered branded mugs that arrived to the wrong address. We took it as a sign we should improve our product. We set up a wall with Post-its, 100 small squares moving in slow choreography. We were in at 7:45 most mornings. We left whenever the building told us to. We worked through Saturdays and most Sundays. People say hustle like it is a shape you can step into. For us, it was a set of quiet choices repeated until they formed a road. There was a night, 2:26 in the morning, January, bitter wind, when our system went sideways. Orders stopped syncing. The error logs filled like a sink with the drain plugged. I stood in the server room listening to fans and my own heartbeat. Sophie said, "I have it." From the floor, cross-legged, laptop balanced on her knee, her hair in a knot that was losing. Hannah placed a paper cup of coffee in my hand and said, Check the Birmingham note. I did. It was misaligned by a single character. Sometimes catastrophe is one letter dressed as a storm. We rolled a fix at 3:08. By 3:20, the orders flowed again. None of our customers knew what had almost happened. That is part of the job, the invisible saving. Along the way, I learned things I did not expect to care about. Shipping containers come in standard lengths for a reason. That standard, boring, and stubborn changed global trade more than most speeches ever will. Data centers are loud and cold at the same time, and even though they run on electricity, they can drink water by the millions of gallons for cooling unless the design is careful. Solid-state drives have no moving parts, which is why the first time you hold one, it feels like the future pretending to be small. When you send a photo across a city, it takes a path not so different from the way ant trails find food, many exploring, one path winning by being slightly better than everybody following. Only the ants are packets of light. Facts like that made the world feel less random. Or maybe they just gave me something to hold when the world shook. I tried to have a life, not just a list of tasks checked off. Sometimes I succeeded. I dated a journalist named Maya Dalton who wore a leather jacket through spring and asked questions that made me slow down. We ate at a diner after midnight more than once. She would trace circles on the condensation of her glass and say, "Do you ever feel like the engine is running and no one is at the wheel?" I would say sometimes. She would smile in a way that said she did not believe me. We lasted 8 months. She left me with a plant I kept alive because it felt like an apology to let it die. The first time we turned down money, it was a Friday at 4:19 in the afternoon. An older company wanted to buy us outright. The number made my stomach sway. Hannah stared at it and said, "We could never worry about payroll again." Sophie said, "We could build what we came here to build." I said, "We should sleep on it." I did not sleep. At 9:06 the next morning, I sent a message that only said, "No." It felt like stepping off a curb you had not seen. On Monday, we came in at 7:52 and got back to work. The sky was gray, and the coffee tasted like paper, and the server room made its usual white noise. Sometimes the drama is all inside. North Star did not grow like a firework. It grew like ivy. We wrapped around ugly problems and held. Big retailers called us. Small ones did too. One winter, a shipping strike made the news. We were on the phone at 5:16 in the morning with a man in a warehouse who sounded like he had swallowed sand. He said, "Tell me which pallets to move to which loading dock number." Sophie ran a script, and her screen filled with numbers that looked like a city lit up at night. "Dock 7, she said, and then, "Dock 3, and then, "Keep Dock 3 open." He followed our voice through his headache. By 11, he said, "I'm going to see my kids tonight because of you." I wrote that on a Post-it and stuck it to my monitor. I still have it. We hired people who were better than us at things we thought we were good at. That is humbling and useful. A woman named Priya moved through bug lists like a chef with a knife. A man named Lucas made our dashboards look like they had always been calm. When we could, we paid early. When we could not, we told the truth. I learned the difference between stubborn and foolish at 2 in the morning more than once. I learned that apologies, delivered quickly and without armor, save time in the long run. When we raised our Series C, words that sound like a staircase you have to climb barefoot, we did it in a room that smelled like new paint. Investors like to schedule things at 9 a.m., as if virtue were easier in daylight. At 9:17, someone asked what would kill us. I said, complacency. He asked, "Do you have any?" I said, "I have fear. I use it." There was a pause that lasted 3 seconds and felt longer. He smiled. He wrote a number on the whiteboard. We nodded because adults nod when paper moves. Sometime later, I went home for Thanksgiving. It was snowing, fat flakes, like it had the night Marcus promised we would make it. My parents' house smelled like turkey and lemon cleaner. My dad asked, at 8:21, "When will you have enough?" He did not mean the money. I said, "I do not know." He said, "Try to know." He said it gently, like a man setting down a heavy box so it does not dent the floor. That night, lying on the couch where I had watched cartoons before school as a kid, I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between the furnace kicking on and off. 27, 31, 28. The numbers did not help. I slept anyway. 2 years passed like a song I knew the words to but could not name. We opened an office in Amsterdam because one of our biggest customers had warehouses near the port of Rotterdam, and because I wanted to walk by canals in the morning and pretend the world was slower. I met a woman named Laura at a conference in Berlin. She wore boots that looked like they had lived lives and told me about a failure she was proud of. We saw each other 10 times in 1 year. It felt like a puzzle we were both willing to assemble without the picture on the box. She said, "I like how you listen." I said, "I like how you make me want to say the next sentence." We lasted longer than I expected and shorter than I hoped. Life is not a neat ledger. It is a drawer where important receipts live beside old birthday candles. When the call finally came about the acquisition, I was in a lift headed to the airport, 6:58 in the morning, a soft rain painting ghosts on the windshield. The number was, again, the kind that makes your stomach sway. The company was large enough to have cafeterias in 3 time zones. They wanted to buy North Star and let us run it inside their bigger animal. "We will leave you alone," they promised, the way rich parents promise their kids they will not meddle with the garage band. We negotiated for what felt like an entire season. Lawyers drafted documents that could have propped up a small table. Hannah kept repeating, "Make it boring," because excitement in a deal usually means you miss something. It closed on a Wednesday at 1:42 in the afternoon. We were in a bland conference room that pretended to be a living room with its fake plants and friendly lamps. Sophie hugged me hard enough to make my ribs notice. Marcus cried for exactly 30 seconds and then laughed at himself. Hannah shook my hand, then, impulsively, my shoulders. "I am proud of us," she said, and then, more quietly, "I am relieved." On paper, I had crossed the line people talk about like it is a fence you can see. The truth is more awkward. You are the same person, just wearing a belt with too many keys. We were not done. Integration is a word that tastes like cardboard until you live it. Systems that had never met were suddenly shaking hands every hour. I flew too much. My body learned the sound of landing gear lowering. I learned the names of airport baristas. I woke in hotel rooms and took 3 seconds to remember the city. 2 in Seattle, 3 in Austin, 2 in London. People smiled and said welcome. People frowned and said not invented here. We smiled back. We pushed gently. We kept pushing. The envelope in Zurich, the one set on the desk at 2:43, contained the final set of sign-offs from a regulatory board that did not like our phrasing about data sovereignty and wanted it to say the same thing with 3 fewer commas. We changed the commas. Here is a thing about scale. Most of it is editing. Editing your product. Editing your schedule. Editing your pride. You cut and cut until the shape that remains can carry weight. I slept until 10:20 that morning and woke to the smell of housekeeping in the hallway. I walked to the lake and watched a swan glare at a dog without moving anything but its neck. A woman in a red coat fed it bread. There are days when wealth sits on your shoulders like a backpack you forgot to take off. There are days when it vanishes and you are just a person looking at a bird, curious about how a neck can be that long. After the acquisition, I stayed on as the head of the thing we had built, inside the bigger thing. I negotiated to spend 1 day a week in Dayton because I wanted to. Because there are corners of you that only unlock when you hear a train at midnight that sounds like the train you heard at 16. I visited my high school. The walls were a different beige, but the smell of the gym had not changed. I brought laptops to the computer lab and told the teacher to let the kids break them. "If you unscrew something, you own a piece of the world," I said, which sounded like a quote until the kids started laughing and I laughed with them. I kept a small office above a bakery on 3rd Street. The owner, Mrs. Kim, wore her hair in a tight bun and knew how cold it was outside without looking. At 6:20 most mornings, she would slide a paper bag across the counter with 2 cinnamon rolls and say, "You look tired." I would say, "I am fine," and she would say, "That is not what I asked." We became friends. I bought the building 2 years later because the landlord was thinking of turning it into condos. I told Mrs. Kim her rent was fixed for 10 years. She cried and then scolded me for making her cry in front of the sourdough. Money changes the surface of things. It does not change the temperature of the coffee or the weight of a hand on your shoulder. There were nights I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between the air conditioner turning on and off. 29, 32, 26. There were mornings I put on a jacket and walked to the office with the same knot in my stomach I had when I was 22, and someone wanted their spreadsheet to match. Somewhere in there, around year 7 of North Star, I realized I had become the person I had once promised myself I would be, and it felt both smaller and larger than expected. Smaller because you are still you. Larger because you can finally reach the light switch without standing on a chair. There were mistakes. I hired a man because he reminded me of me, which is a lazy way to say I did not do the work of seeing him clearly. He was charming and sloppy. He heard a junior engineer with a comment delivered as a joke. When she told him it stung, he laughed. I fired him at 10:18 on a Tuesday, and then I sat with the engineer in the small conference room with the bad art and said, "I am sorry." She said, "I know." She stayed. Later she led a team that made our routing engine twice as fast. We named a meeting room after her grandmother because she said her grandmother was the first person who made her feel safe and seen at the same time. When we opened a campus in Austin, we put a mural on the wall of a winding river that looked suspiciously like an algorithm if you squinted. At 5:45 one evening, I walked past two people arguing about whether to use a tree or a hash map for a particular problem, and I felt the same quiet joy I had felt at 14 when the beige box hummed awake. I stood there longer than I needed to, and then moved on because leaders moving on is a way of letting rooms be rooms instead of stages. The closest I came to losing everything after the acquisition was not a lawsuit or a market swing. It was a power outage on a hot Sunday in August when a data center in Phoenix went down because a transformer failed and the backup generator, which had been tested every month like a ritual, decided not to believe in rituals. At 1:07 in the afternoon, my phone screamed. By 1:20 we were rerouting. By 1:42 we had 90% back. By 2:13 we were whole. Customers wrote in to say thank you. One wrote to say nothing and then sent us cookies with a note that said, "I went to my kid's soccer game because you did your job." I put that note next to the post-it. Some trophies are paper. A year later, I took my parents to Italy. We stood on a street in Rome at 9:11 in the morning drinking coffee, so small it felt like a dare. My dad said, "I still wake up at 6. My mom said, "I still count beds in my head before I fall asleep." Old habits do not vanish. They learn to share space. We looked at a church that had been standing for centuries because people kept showing up to fix it. That felt like a reason to keep going. I will tell you something else, and I will tell it gently. The envy people carry toward the wealthy is sometimes a mirror they hold up to themselves. I have been envied and I have envied. Neither is useful for long. What is useful is the feel of a keyboard under your fingers at 5:59 in the morning when the sky is a soft blue and the city is still deciding what kind of day it will be. What is useful is calling your father at 7:32 and asking him how to fix a sound you hear under your car, and him saying, "Describe it," and you trying, and him laughing, and you laughing too. What is useful is sending a message at 2:21 to a person on your team that only says, "You helped more than you know." You hit send. You breathe. Some nights I walk along the river in Dayton and count the steps between the streetlights. 36, 36, 36. The water moves like time moves. Forward, mostly, with eddies where leaves spin patiently. I pass the spot where teenage me first imagined a different life, and I try not to make it sacred because it was just a place a boy stood while thinking a thought many boys have thought. I pass a bench where Laura and I sat one autumn afternoon and try to pretend distance was a math problem we could solve. I pass a woman in a yellow coat walking a dog that looks like it might tell a joke if given the chance. The dog looks at me like we share a secret. Maybe we do. Maybe it is simply that we are here. People ask, sometimes, what I would tell my younger self. It is an easy game to play and a hard one to win. I would not tell him to buy this stock or that coin or that parcel of land outside Austin. I would tell him to be kind quickly, and to fix the thing he breaks even if no one saw him break it, and to say yes to the coffee with the person who seems slightly out of his orbit because orbits change with practice. I would tell him that the work that matters will often look boring from the outside and feel like devotion from the inside. I would tell him to write numbers down because memory is a liar. I would tell him the furnace will be fine. I would tell him there will be nights when he counts seconds in the dark and mornings when the counting stops on its own. And if I could pick one moment to live again, not to change, just to hold, I would choose a small one. The four of us around the wobbly table, the stack of manuals under the leg, pins that did not quite write unless you shook them, the smell of someone's oat milk latte, the clock on the wall that said 11:27. We said, out loud, the name we had chosen for our company, as if speaking it would nail it to the air. We laughed at how ideas sound ridiculous when they are new. We signed where they told us to sign. We went back to our laptops. Outside, a delivery truck hissed and pulled away, and a man on the sidewalk took off his hat and wiped his forehead, and a woman pushed a stroller while talking on the phone, and upstairs the heat clicked on and on again. In Zurich, after I opened the envelope and read what I already knew it contained, I sat for a while and listened to the minibar hum and the elevator cables wind through the wall. At 3:12, I lay down fully dressed and stared at the dark square of the ceiling. I thought of the boy counting train cars. I thought of the girl with vanilla shampoo. I thought of Sophie on the server room floor and Hannah's steady eyes and Marcus's laugh. I thought of Mrs. Kim scolding me kindly and of my father's flashlight beam like a sword in the basement. I thought of Laura's boots and Maya's leather jacket and the plant I kept alive. I counted my breaths up to 40, then started over at 1, because sometimes loops are a comfort. At 8:04 I woke to the city shaking itself awake. I showered. I put on a shirt that made me look like I slept better than I did. I checked my phone. There were messages, of course. There are always messages. I answered the ones that needed breath behind them with a voice memo, so people could hear how I felt. I have learned that tone is a bridge money cannot build. Then I walked outside and joined the day like a man joining a slow parade. The air smelled like bread. The lake was a mirror where clouds practiced being clouds. On the flight home, I watched the sun set somewhere over the Atlantic, a line of orange thinning into gray. The captain said we would land at 7:22 local. I closed my eyes and pictured a warehouse at night. That particular emptiness, the sound of distant forklifts, the way one light always stays on like a promise. I pictured a kid in a computer lab at 1:19, sneezing at dust he would later romanticize. I pictured an old heater coughing back to life because someone who loved us would not let it die. When the wheels kissed the runway, gently, like two palms meeting, I opened my eyes and felt the weft and weave of everything that had carried me. The past, the present, and the little pieces of the future that arrive before you think you deserve them. I turned my phone on. I texted Sophie a dumb joke about commas. I told Hannah I had read the last draft, and it was clean. I told Marcus I would be at the office by 9:20 with bagels. He wrote back, "I knew you would." Then I stood, stretched, and waited with everyone else for the doors to open. We all know how to do that part. We stand, we wait, we step forward when the person in front of us steps forward. The line moves. The world goes on. And somewhere, always, something that was broken is humming again.